down into it, and a lot of times we bring on great guests, including my next guest, who is Rob Pincus. He is the one of the founders of the Personal Defense Network. He also has ICE training, works at Avidity Firearms. The guy wears a bunch of different hats, but he is one of the best firearms instructors in the country, and of course a huge firearms enthusiast, supporter, one of the prominent members of the gun culture out there, who dares to ask some of the hard questions and bring some real common sense to the discussion. We are happy to bring him on the program today. Rob, thanks for coming in and joining us, my friend.
Great to be here. It's always good to join you on Firearms Friday, and it's been a busy week.
I was just telling folks that you sent me that article, and I was just shocked. I mean, I don't normally peruse NPR. I mean, I surf a lot of different sites to source news in different areas, but NPR is usually one that I don't normally just jump right onto. And you could have knocked me over with a feather when I picked up this article that you sent me and took a look at it and thought, wow, maybe investigative journalism in this country is not actually dead.
No, I think it's definitely not dead. I think you have to look hard for it. I don't think it's in most of the typical places that we go for our, headlines or breaking news. I think a lot of people have said that they were surprised the NPR was the source on this. But I got to tell you, they've done, I think, a decent job of reporting on the firearms issues that we're concerned about in a very fair way over the years. I've been a guest on their shows several times. I know several other people in the industry who I would consider critical thinkers and thoughtful commentators, debaters, conversationalists from our side have been on a lot of different NPR shows. They don't entertain the rhetoric. They don't want someone going on the show slamming the table saying, "Shall not be infringed, what don't you understand?" But I think they do have some good dialogues, and I think there are definitely some reporters there who have sincere intentions to represent gun rights and gun control sides fairly.
And I think one of the interesting things about this is that this is one of the more widely repeated messages out there. The premise of this article was, of course, this number from the Department of Education that talked about the number of school shootings. Now, they don't call them mass shootings. Remember, you got to pick down into the details of how they word things. But they said school shootings, and that in America we had 240 school shootings in a single year, nearly one a day, et cetera, et cetera. But when you get down into it, it turns out that number is wrong by 80%. We only, in fact, had 11 school shootings that they could confirm off of that list, and they spent 3 months kind of going through this and tracking it down, which raises my previous question as I was bringing you on, Rob. I said I think that there's a lot of time there's misinformation or just outright wrong facts that go out there, sometimes unintentionally, but sometimes intentionally. And do you have a feel on where we're falling on this kind of on this scale, on those two choices?
Well, I think that it's probably a pretty healthy combination of both. One of the things I lament in our dialogues, quote unquote, on social media is the unverified share, right? The unvetted story that gets promulgated or pushed around, repeated over and over again, often by people who agree with the premise, right? But sometimes even by people who are just mad about the premise being shared. So it's kind of like you read the headline and it makes you mad. You share it to people that are also going to be mad in your social media audience, and then it gets a life of its own. We had one just earlier this week where someone was complaining or shared an article, a video piece from one of the extreme right-wing, quote unquote news sources,
right.
Where the guy was angry about what had happened. I think it was in Utah at one of the universities, somewhere out west. I believe it was Utah, one of the universities. And the headline was sort of like, university professor shames legal concealed carrier and puts these policies in place that were ridiculous. And it was a ridiculous policy. It was like a taped off square in the room. If you want to carry a gun in this room,
right,
the university is going to let you, but you have to stand in this shame square or whatever, right?
Right.
And the problem was that so all this energy was being put out there about how horrible this was, and it was crazy, and it was, leftist agenda, blah, blah, blah. The fact is that, like, it had already been dealt with by the university. It had already been reversed. It was the teacher's assistant who wrote that policy a grad student was already sanctioned and removed from that class as an influencer. Like, so, it was one of these things that was being sensationalized and as if a full tenured professor and as if the university was allowing it to happen. And it was a non-story, right? So what happens? We get these reports, going back to the NPR story, we get these reports that there was a gun incident at a school that turns into a school shooting that gets added to the list of things like the Parkland, Florida tragedy in February. And it turns out it was somebody had a plastic gun in a backpack on the bus, and it was misreported and then added to some list and never vetted and never verified. So it's actually, you said 80% wrong. It's actually 95%, right? If you go from the 230-something number they had and you go down to 11 actually verified, right? If you count the ones that couldn't be confirmed or denied, you add another 50 in and you get closer to that 80% number. But if you really look at how many would the school district actually say, yes, it happened and here are the details, and it met what we think of as a colloquial definition of school shooting, it was 11 out of the 235, which is just staggering.
Right. And you look at this and you're like, okay, so if that number is wrong, what does that say about some of the other numbers that we've been talking about and that are oft quoted out in the news? And again, not that I'm paranoid, Rob, and not that I'm cynical, but at some point, I mean, I still remember the Fast and Furious debacle and, of course, the assertion from Hillary Clinton et al. Under the Obama administration that 80% of the guns in Mexico were coming from the United States, which is a number that has been since debunked many times, including the fact that the vast majority of those guns that are in Mexico were from legal arms sales that were approved by the State Department to the Mexican government, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But, I mean, we keep seeing these numbers being puffed and thrown around, and again, it's the whole 35,000 people die from gun deaths, or die for gun deaths a year. Of course, never telling you that 65 to 70% of them are suicides that would have probably committed suicide anyway. They just happen to use the gun instead of some other form. I mean, it becomes almost to a point to where you're feeling like it's just disingenuousness. I try and give them the benefit of doubt to say it's intentional or not intentional, but at some point you got to say, this is really kind of a battle we're fighting, and we've got to be smarter about it and rely on actual verifiable facts.
Well, it's on both sides. I think both sides, it's very convenient to take a number that now you're going to put somebody else who's going to have the accountability for that number. So you're going to say, according to so-and-so's research. And the problem is what we see far too often is people in the news media, in what is supposed to be journalism, but it's really turned into news media for the most part, repeating each other's numbers. So you'll see a quote from the New York Times. You'll see a quote from the Washington Post. You'll see a quote from USA Today. So you're like third or fourth or fifth source now by the time you're quoting this statistic, this data, and that really creates a problem. You mentioned suicide. I've been dealing a lot with a new project called Walk the Talk America. It's a collaborative project between leaders in the gun industry and mental health professionals. And we're trying to address 4 areas. One of the main ones is suicide prevention, and suicide prevention actually kind of overlaps with the other ones, firearms negligence, trauma mitigation, and child/school safety. And what we find is that there's a lot of overlaps. If you look at the at-risk indicators of someone who might commit a spree killing or a school shooting and someone who might commit suicide with a firearm, some of the at-risk indicators are the same. In fact, a great number of them can be the same. But it doesn't mean anybody with any one of those individual indicators, whatever that may be, on an SSRI. People make a big deal about that this week after the Jacksonville shooting at the gaming center, right? That guy was on this SSRI type drug, but so are literally millions of other people who don't shoot up, gaming events or schools. So we have to be careful how we take that one data point. What I think happens far too often is we see a data point that supports our agenda, and we then build it into our narrative. Or we see a data point that we want to refute, and we just say, oh, well, you can't trust data. I'll tell you, honestly, I'm not a numbers guy. If I'm doing an interview with anyone in the media, if you ask me right now to talk about the suicide issue, I'll tell you that depending on whose numbers you use, between 80 and 90% of the completed suicides occur with a firearm, right? And that's from the mental health side. But it varies, what numbers they are and what year it is and what age brackets and all these things, right? What I can tell you is that attempted suicides with a firearm are far more likely to be successful than attempted suicides by any other means. So that is an issue. And we can't, as gun owners, shy away from that issue by saying something to the extent of, well, they would have tried it some other way. Maybe they would have, but the data that is real says that they would have tried some other way, and they would have had a much lower likelihood of completing that suicide by virtually any other means than firearms. So that's an issue. If we have that person in our life who we can intervene, we can talk to, we can offer to, hey, let me clean your guns this week, buddy. Or, hey, you lost your job, you got an alcohol thing going on, your wife's about to leave you. How about not have the gun on your body as you're going to, drive through that commuter traffic tomorrow? Do you need the gun? And that's not a legal intervention. That's not calling the police. That's not a new law. That's not changing HIPAA. That's just being a responsible friend and family member and responsible gun owner and being ready to have those conversations with people. And I think that's something we need to be ready to do. We can't be so afraid of admitting that potential that we, for political reasons, ignore our responsibilities as human beings.
Right. We're talking with Rob Pincus, by the way, from the Personal Defense Network, ICE Training, Avidity Firearms. Rob, I think you're making a valid point. I think what we have here is a deeper issue with mental health. I mean, and obviously attempted suicides with a firearm, generally speaking, are going to be more successful than I mean, it is really the most efficient tool in that regard. But I mean, again, I think that all points back to an issue of more societal, cultural, mental health issue. I mean, I've used the example, for example, of Japan. Japan has some of the toughest gun control laws in the world, and yet they also have one of the highest suicide rates of any industrialized nation. So, I mean, on a per capita basis. So, again, it's an issue that I think goes back to the mentality, and I think that's. I mean, I admire what you're doing here, kind of this crossroads between mental health and firearms and everything else. That seems to be the one. You were talking about different indicators and different levels and things where they're meshing up. These data points are meshing up. The thing is that the commonality, it seems to be, between a lot of these mass shootings over the last 30 years has been there has been some kind of mental health issue, some kind of known issue. Generally speaking, something like 85 or 90% of these shooters have had some kind of known mental health issue, and yet we continue to kind of ignore that as the obvious truth. How do we? And of course, the confluence is that we've got privacy, we've got HIPAA laws, we've got all these other kinds of things. We have no institutionalized care really in the country, as far as used to be involuntary commitment. You can't do that now. There's a lot of issues here. What are some of the solutions that you see to try and fix that one glaring data point that I think is standing up above all others?
Well, here's the danger, I think, of even going down that road. Because if you talk about mass shootings, there's going to be another data point, and that's into firearms, right? That's universal. So sure. You can say, well, 90-something%, the vast majority of people who commit these things have a history of quote-unquote mental illness. Well, 100% of mass shootings occur with a firearm. So we got to be careful about that one data point that seems to be the key, because obviously we're going to keep coming back to a mass shooting isn't going to happen if that person doesn't have a firearm. Well, we don't want to take firearms away. We want to ban firearms. We don't want to blame a thing. But we also can't. What I've learned over the last few months of working with mental health and trying to collaborate on these things, is that we can't sit on the pro-gun side and point across the aisle and say, well, look, it's all a mental health problem. They need to figure it out, because just like we would say that there's 0.000 whatever percentage of guns that have been used in these violent attacks, they're also going to remind us that only 0.0000% of people diagnosed with some form of mental illness are violent, right, towards other people. So we have to be really careful. And I think empowering that and talking about the stigma, right? Again, as you said, the common ground is going to be suicide prevention. So if we can say, we have vets who are afraid to ask for help because of all the stigma of mental health in the first place, as combat vets, people who are in control, people who have done amazing things, people who have won battles, people who have saved lives, people who have taken lives. These are strong human beings that don't want to ask for help. So there's already this stigma. Now you added to it the potential threat of, and I might lose my Second Amendment rights if I ask for the wrong kind of help or ask for help in the wrong way. Now we've got a two-layer prohibition to seeking the help that they need. And we know that there's a huge problem with suicide. There's issues with domestic violence, alcoholism, all of these ramifications of PTSD inside of the veterans community. And if all we do as gun owners, obviously the vast majority of veterans are also going to be gun owners, or at least supporters of the right to keep and bear arms and the Second Amendment. If all we do is make it sound like mental health's a problem, mental health a negative, you don't want to be stigmatized by having a mental health problem, we're actually discouraging them from seeking the help that they need.
Yeah, no, and again, that's kind of the direction that I was going on this. I mean, kind of that point of, how do we wrestle with this problem while keeping, from stigmatizing a whole section of the population, while retaining people's, privacy rights, while doing all these things. I mean, here's the problem, Rob, and this is just my opinion. We're going to go to break here, but I think that part of the problem is we live in a 148 character society today. Everybody wants things to be a quick fix. They want one simple solution that you can tweet out about. They want a soundbite. The problem is that this issue, as in many issues that we're actually dealing with today in actuality, are so complex and they have so many moving parts that you can't fix it in a tweet. You can't fix it there's no magic bullet, pardon the pun. There's no magic bullet to fix this problem. It's going to be an issue that it's going to take years to deal with, and it's going to have all the stakeholders at the table, and there's going to be a tremendous amount of work that's going to have to go into it. You can't fix it just overnight with one single, even if you remove guns from the equation in this regard, you're still not going to fix the underlying problems with everything else that's going on. Hold on a second, Rob. Rob Pincus is our guest. He is the founder of Personal Defense Network. He also does ICE Training, which is his training company where he travels around the country with PDN and ICE, training folks around there. And he's over there at Divinity Firearms. Like I said, he's a busy guy. We got more coming up. Don't go anywhere. The Michael Duke Show continues. It is your home for common sense, liberty-based, free-thinking gun radio. Back with more right after this.
But we got together, and I really appreciate you being willing to go, kind of in directions that, a lot of the more rhetoric-filled shows, I guess, just don't want to go. They just, everything is somebody else's fault, and it's right. Never our responsibility. And I think that's the key, is we have to take some ownership on the grassroots level. We have to take some ownership about protecting our families, protecting our friends, and getting involved.
Absolutely. Well, and here's the thing, Rob. This is I'm a pragmatist. Okay. Now, first of all, I'm a libertarian, which means I kind of take things from a whole different perspective than kind of the whole left-right dichotomy to begin with. But I'm also a pragmatist. I'm not a theoretical libertarian where everything would be kumbaya if we could just live by some principles. I understand that there's some pragmatism that has to go in here, and I understand that. A lot of what we're dealing with today, first of all, from a gun perspective, from a gun culture perspective, is a hearts and minds campaign. I mean, really, we are fighting a war, a PR war against a news media and an entertainment industry that wants to vilify absolutely everything we do, that are not reasonable in a lot of the things that we're trying to do. So we need to be excruciatingly reasonable. We need to look at all perspectives. We need to address and discuss all things, even things that make us as gun culture guys makes us uncomfortable or makes us, maybe even things that potentially somebody could say, well, that puts us in a bad light. We shouldn't talk about that. We should talk. It's one of the reasons why we should talk about it. We should embrace it, take a look at it. If it's a problem for us, if it's something that we have wrong with it, then we need to address how do we fix that? I mean, otherwise, this problem is just going to continue, and they'll continue to beat the gun culture to death for problems that really are probably, in the long run, not the root cause is not the gun culture, but we are the easy whipping boy on all of that kind of stuff.
For sure, and that's what we want to avoid is creating that same effect from us on the mental health world. And just say, well, we're just going to blame mental health, because that's really been the trend, is mental health.
Sure.
Oh, that's great, except if we're not, and that's what Walk the Talk America is about. If we're not actually trying to figure out what's going on over there, how we can get involved, admitting that there are problems of gun negligence or perception of what it means to ask for help and those things inside of our community, we're not going to solve anything.
Right. Well, and we face that. I mean, I know that you have taken a lot of heat over, just even over the last few months, I've seen kind of the rhetoric against you on some of your Facebook posts kind of ramped up, like, how could you say that? I mean, don't you believe in guns? Kind of, I mean, I'm kind of paraphrasing, but really kind of this incredulity that Rob Pincus, how could you say that? Aren't you a gun guy? Don't you believe that it's their fault, so to speak, and they're being the amorphous whoever it is? Isn't it their fault? How could you say that? And again, it seems like reasoned, rational arguments to say just by ignoring it doesn't make the problem go away. We've got to address these issues. Seems to really put folks like you in the and sometimes me in the crosshairs on those kind of things instead of, and when we get into the infighting instead of actually addressing the true problem.
Well, I think some of that's healthy, right? Some of that helps us kind of weed out the problem children on our own side. We need to see who's really going to double, triple, and quadruple down on, no, guns have nothing to do with suicide. There's nothing to talk about here, right? Who's going to double and triple and quadruple down on, no, unsecured guns, kids getting their hands on unsecured guns isn't a problem. There's nothing to see here. Like, those guys just need to obviously, they need to stop representing us as gun owners, and they need to stop being, what I'll say is, I think at this point, tolerated or encouraged by that tolerance inside of our community. People say, well,
that's the intent at some point, but we've got to basically come back and be able to defend gun rights, but do it in a reasonable manner. Rob, hold on a second here. We are about 25 seconds out, getting ready to join back in on the radio. Folks, you're listening to The Michael Duke Show. Rob Pincus is our guest. Mash that share button, will you, here on Facebook Live, and get the word out. We're talking about guns and suicide and more, and how important it is to work on these issues. Don't go anywhere. Let's kick things off. It, baby. Welcome back. It is the Michael Duke Show. Common Sense Radio is what we do. And today, of course, is our Common Sense Gun Radio portion, where we spend the show today kind of talking about the Second Amendment, issues around firearms, and what we as responsible gun owners need to do to try and further the conversation without, again, impeding on any of the rights that we are due. And that's why we brought Rob Pincus back on the program. Rob is one of the founders of the Personal Defense Network, and he does training around the country. What is it, Rob, like 47 weeks a year or something you're traveling around the country?
It's a lot. Actually, I'm going to be doing a little bit more work static at the Western headquarters. We actually put in a broadcast remote studio for some of the video e-learning interactive stuff we do through Personal Defense Network here. I'm sitting in it now, actually, so I'm going to be doing a little bit more work from Colorado. But yeah, I've averaged about 300 days a year on the road for about a decade.
Yeah, I mean, it's insane. And, of course, he's dedicated to it. I mean, it's not just a profession. It's an avocation for him to go out there and make sure that citizens, law enforcement, reserve military, I mean, all these folks have the best possible training that they can because, again, like I've said earlier in the program, having the training makes you more proficient with the tools, which makes you more, comfortable in what you're doing and gives you what you need to be able to protect yourself, your family, and other people. And it gives you a leg to stand on when you're talking about these issues. You'll have a little bit of a position of authority if you've done these kind of things and done this kind of training to get that information. Rob, during the break, we were talking here with the Facebook crowd about, some of these issues of, the differences. I mean, you come on this show because I'm open to talking about, the things that may be more taboo on some of the mainstream gun type shows because it becomes a he said, she said. Well, it's not your fault. It's not my fault. It's their fault. It's them. It's us. We get into this finger pointing. And of course, the problem is that the finger pointing never solves the issue. The finger pointing really all it does is it's a deflection. And we really have a deeper issue. So we were just talking about how complex it is with mental health and firearms rights. To say that guns don't factor into suicides is obviously a falsehood because they do account for a tremendous number of suicides, but also there's the component of mental health in that. And so we've got this kind of these tenuous connections. How do we fix this? I mean, you've been working on this issue now for a few months with people in the mental health industry, trying to find this confluence of these issues. Have you come up with a solution, or are we working towards a solution? Do we have anything that we can kind of throw out there for folks to think about?
Well, I've been working on this problem for years, one way or another. Michael Sedini actually came to me, a good friend of mine, partner of mine at Avidity, came to me a few months ago and said, he had this idea about starting a new organization, Walk the Talk America, that would actually reach sort of across the aisle over to mental health. He had read a position paper from the organization called Mental Health America, which he shared with me, one of the oldest mental health rights advocacy groups. They're a rights advocacy group for the people that have been diagnosed with mental illnesses, for people that need help. And they've got chapters all over the country. They've been around for over 100 years. And they basically wrote a position paper that said, we're not going to get into guns. We're not gun experts. We're not gun people. We don't know. But what we do know is that it doesn't help when people who are pro-gun rights simply point a finger at mental health and say it's all your problem. The fact is, this is where this idea first really became so apparent to us, was that that stigma that exists for gun ownership in America also exists for mental illness. And where the crossroads are is our suffering vets. Where the crossroads are is the teen, the troubled teen, and the parent not knowing how to identify that, or being afraid to deal with a teen that needs help, the coworkers, whatever it may be. Well, one of the initiatives we're looking for is, again, we're looking for some very proactive strategies. We're looking to put some programs in place, not to just talk about this stuff, but to actually do something. One of the things that I think we're really close to is we're trying to work with some mental health professionals and organizations to be able to help identify what really is an at-risk indicator for either suicide or violence inside of the schools in regard to weapons. We hear these phrases come out of mental health or out of the education circles, like obsessed with firearms or obsessed with weapons. Well, what does that mean? Because if the school guidance counselor thinks that means somebody goes hunting in the fall with their grandfather and now they're obsessed with weapons because they put up an Instagram picture of them with a deer, that's not what it should mean. So what we're actually working with is mental health professionals to be able to say, here are things that are normal interactions with firearms for kids. Here are things that should not be a red flag. Here are things that you should not be alarmed by. And how have them, I don't know that this document exists, and we're trying to make it exist now, where mental health professionals will actually say to a school guidance counselor or to someone with a pro-gun control agenda or an anti-gun rights agenda, and say, no, you cannot characterize every interaction between kids and guns, whether it's competition or collecting or reading a gun magazine during the lunch break. You cannot consider that a risk indicator. That is normal behavior in many households and for many families, and for the vast majority of the history of our country, for all Americans, that's normal behavior. So we're trying to put those things in place. We're also looking at a program that's going to go nationwide relatively quickly for an online training course for range staff. I've had a couple of ranges that I work with over the last 18 months affected by this rare occurrence, granted, but it does happen. People go into the gun range, they rent a gun, and they commit suicide. And sometimes you say, oh, yeah, that guy was a little off. And other times it's, nope, I had no pre-indicators whatsoever. We see some ranges try to put certain policies in place. You can't shoot alone, or you have to go through this, safety briefing, or you have to have an interview if you're a new member, those kinds of things. But some of them have not been effective. So we're trying to, again, work with mental health to create a 30-minute free online course. People can go to Walk the Talk America, take that course. Range owners or range managers can have their staff members take this course, not only to identify potential risk indicators and pre-contact cues of someone who might be suicidal, but also how to bring it up, how to talk about providing a service such as, if it's not someone who's renting a gun, if it's somebody who's bought a gun, or someone who's a regular member, somebody who's coming in to shoot, maybe again offering an opportunity for them to leave their guns there. So, picture a yellow kind of lockbox on the counter with some literature and some signage, hey, if you'd rather someone else was holding your guns, let us know, because we'll do that free of charge or whatever. And that outreach to peers coming from gun owners, from obviously pro-gun businesses, to other gun owners. I think what happens is we know that people respond really well to that outreach from a friend. People respond well to that outreach from a family member. I think people pick up on the cues. They know that you care. And if you just were to say to your friend that's having a hard time, hey, how about I take your guns and clean them this weekend? How about if I hold those for a few days? They probably know what you're really saying, but you don't have to be confrontational about it. It doesn't have to create drama. And certainly we don't have to, we need to stop worrying about this idea that if we talk about suicide, or if we ask if someone's depressed, that is somehow going to send them over the edge. because, according to the professionals that deal with this every day, those helplines and the advertisements for those helplines work. Outreach works. Peer intervention works.
Right, and I think showing people that you care, I mean, again, I don't think it has a tendency to push more. I think it has a tendency to say, I do care. Can I help you? Can I carry this burden? Can I help you carry the load that you're carrying? And I think that that's important. Rob Pincus is our guest. Rob, we're down to the last 90 seconds. Can you fill us in on how to find out more about Walk the Talk and all the things that you do?
Yeah, people can obviously go to any of my social media. They'll see links. We had an event called Denver Gun Days. Denver Gun Day last weekend was the first time that Walk the Talk America was sort of shared with the public. People can go to Instagram, Walk the Talk US, or on Facebook, they can go to Walk the Talk America. There is also a website for walkthetalkamerica.org. Coming soon is all you're going to see if you go there now. But give us some follows, give us some likes, keep an eye on it. Certainly keep an eye on my social media. And for some of these topics, especially the ones dealing with gun negligence and the ones dealing with talking to kids about guns, people can always go to personaldefensenetwork.com and use the search bar to find the relevant training information from me and from many other contributors from around the world.
Rob Pincus. Again, you can find him out there on Facebook. Personaldefensenetwork.com is the website for the main company there. Rob, as always, my friend, I really appreciate you coming on. This is great info, and I look forward to talking with you again about it soon. Thanks so much. I'm reading the chat room right now. As always, Rob just jumps in. Rob, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. I'll send you some links later on this morning, sir, so that you can I'll show you some links for both the video component here on Facebook, but also for the I'll get you the audio-only version so that you can share that out with people as well if you want to kind of push this. And I appreciate what you're doing, my friend. This whole idea of mental health and guns, again, I agree with you, and I never really considered it from that perspective. I mean, I always said that mental health was a component. I don't think I ever blamed it per se, but you're right. Folks in that industry have got to feel a lot of ways, in a lot of ways like we feel, kind of that persecution of, hey, 99.99% of all gun owners are law-abiding and lawful, just like 99.99% of all sufferers from mental health issues are probably law-abiding and lawful, and there's a very interesting parallel between those two, and quite honestly, it makes them natural allies in this fight. And instead of pointing fingers at each other, I'm excited about the fact that you are instead embracing this opportunity to partner up and to talk about these things and to find some kind of way to find a solution between the two of us, between the gun culture and the mental health, institutions and industry, to say, look, we're both being singled out wrongly in the long run. So how do we do that? I think that we need to rephrase this conversation. I think that's what needs to happen, is that we rephrase and kind of reframe the whole conversation into something that is understandable by the public, because whether we agree with it or not, it's still 148 character society, and we've got to find some sound bites and things that help reinforce this, because that seems to be what citizens and the public understands best. But at the same time, you're right. Quit circling the wagons and shooting inward, which is what we're doing. We're circling the wagons and then hurting each other. So anyway, it's very good stuff. Rob Pincus, again, fantastic. And if you don't follow Rob on Facebook, you should, because he's always coming out with words of wisdom on the firearms stuff, or the gun culture stuff.